Hey there, welcome to Psychology. Today we're going to talk about psychology methods. In this, we'll talk about our case study. We'll be learning from a flawed experiment. Section 1 will be conducting research. Section 2, surveys, samples, and populations. Section 3, using observation for research. Section 4, the experimental ethical issues. And then we'll talk through an experiment. All right, the Hawthorne Effect shows that the research methods must be sound if the results of the study are to be reliable. The Hawthorne Effect is the tendency of research subjects to change their behavior as a result of their awareness of being observed. It was named for a 1927 workplace study. Flaws of the Hawthorne study was not a blind study. It did not have a control group, and the sample size was too small. Results of the study may have been misinterpreted. What flaws did the Hawthorne study have? And how did these flaws affect the study's outcome? The Hawthorne Effect, and why do some people question its existence? So, women in the factory worked such as these assembled electrical equipment at the Hawthorne plant. And what they did was they would put them in a group and to be studied. They became aware that they were being studied, so it improved their work performance as a result. And so as a result of that, the purpose of the study was distorted. Maybe we'll talk about how this comes together. So, scientific research consists of 5 basic steps: forming a research question, forming a hypothesis, testing the hypothesis, analyzing the results, and drawing conclusions. After the 5 steps are completed, scientists attempt to replicate the results and often ask new questions based on those results. The steps that scientists follow in conducting research are fundamental to reaching reliable conclusions. Psychologists follow similar steps conducting research. Psychologists tend to use the same general procedure when conducting research. The procedure consists of 6 steps. The first step is forming a research question. Research questions are best focused on behavior rather than constructs that cannot be seen or measured directly. Forming a hypothesis. Psychologists next form a hypothesis about the answer to the research question. A hypothesis is an educated guess. The accuracy of a hypothesis can be tested by research. The next step is testing the hypothesis. A hypothesis can be considered to be correct until it has been scientifically tested and proved to be right. Opinions are not considered. Psychologists rely on evidence, and psychologists use a variety of research methods to test a hypothesis. Psychologists analyze results after they've tested the hypothesis. What do their findings mean? The more information psychologists collect, the more complex a task it is to analyze it. Psychologists often look for patterns and relationships in the data. Psychologists draw conclusions about their research and their hypothesis. When observations do not support a hypothesis, they often must change the theories or beliefs from which the hypothesis was derived. This means psychologists must keep open minds, adjust or modify their hypothesis if their findings make it necessary to do so. Replication. For the findings of a study to be confirmed, the study must be replicated, which means it must be repeated and produce the same results as before. Some scientists repeat a study under different circumstances than the original study. Sometimes the study is repeated with a different set of participants. If the study involves people, participants can vary in gender, age, ethnicity, social, economic background, and location. Research findings usually lead to new questions. New questions are tested using the same process. Different research methods are used to test hypotheses. These methods include the survey method, various observational methods, and the experimental method. Section 2. Scientists use the survey method by interviewing people or by distributing questionnaires. Scientists must carefully choose which groups of people they wish to study. Our main idea in this section is that one way to gather information is by asking people directly. Psychologists use this method to study people's attitudes and behaviors. So what is the survey method is what you should be focused on. How do populations and samples affect research? And how do psychologists select samples? Why must researchers be careful in generalizing the results? And what is volunteer bias? Psychologists usually use a survey to gather information about people by asking them directly. A survey is a series of questions people are asked to answer about a particular subject. Psychologists conduct surveys by asking people to fill out written questionnaires or by interviewing people orally. The findings of interviews and questionnaires may not be completely accurate. People may not be honest about their attitudes or behavior. People may limit their responses for privacy reasons, or people may say what they think the interviewers want to hear. To accurately predict an outcome, psychologists study a group that represents the target population. The target population is the whole group they want to study or describe. The target population includes only people who are relevant to the survey. Because it would be costly and difficult to interview or question every member of the target population, researchers study a sample. A sample is only part of the target population. Psychologists select samples scientifically to ensure the samples accurately represent the populations they are supposed to represent. A sample would be as similar as possible to the target population. One of the scientists obtain an accurate sample is to use random sample, in which individuals are selected by chance from the target population. Another type of sample is a stratified sample, which consists of subgroups in the population that are represented proportionally. A large random sample is likely to be accurately stratified, even if researchers take no steps to ensure that it is. A large sample size by itself does not necessarily guarantee the sample represents the target population. Sometimes researchers do not use samples that represents an entire population. In such cases, researchers are cautious about generalizing the findings. Researchers cannot learn about the preferences of all people by studying only one group of people. Researchers cannot learn about the attitudes of Americans in general if they limit their observations to only men or only women, or to people who live in one part of the country, or to people from one socioeconomic background. When conducting surveys, psychologists are aware that bias may occur on the part of the respondents. Bias is a predisposition to a certain point of view despite what the facts suggest. Psychologists are also aware of volunteer bias. People who volunteer to participate in studies may have a different outlook from people who do not volunteer. Volunteers are usually more willing to disclose personal information. They may have more spare time to participate, and volunteers probably do not represent the target population. Cultural diversity in psychology, diversity in research. Most psychologists today appreciate the need to allow for a wider diversity of members of society in their research. This has not always been the case. For example, men have been included as research study participants more often than women. This led psychologists to mistakenly generalize their findings beyond men. Many research participants were originally drawn from white men. Studies that have included more diverse populations have shown that heart disease affects women differently than it affects men, and that African Americans are more likely to get heart disease than whites. More diversified research on domestic violence has revealed that men and children are victims as well as women. Recent research with members of the older populations has shed light on the topics of concern to the elderly. Section 3. There are using an observation for research. There are a number of other methods of observation besides the survey method. The testing method, the case study method, the longitudinal method, and the cross-sectional method, and the naturalistic observation method, and the laboratory observation method. Correlation describes but does not reveal cause and effect. In analyzing the results of observations, correlation is an important technique. The main idea: psychologists use many different methods of observation in conducting their research. Then they use correlation to analyze and interpret their results. So our reading focus would be, what are some of the methods of observation in the psychological research, and how do researchers analyze their observations? In addition to the survey method of observation, other methods of observation include testing, case study, longitudinal, cross-sectional, naturalistic observation, and laboratory observation methods. The testing method. Psychologists use several kinds of psychological tests, including intelligence tests, aptitude tests, and personality tests. A case study is an in-depth investigation of an individual or a small group. Psychologists use what they learn in a case study to generalize broader principles that apply to the larger population. In the longitudinal method, researchers select a group of participants and then observe those participants over a period of time, often years or even decades. Psychologists use this method to observe how people change over time. And there's a famous series called the 7-Up series, where they followed a group of English school children from the time they were age 7 all the way up to, I think the last one they did was the 50 up or 60 up. That must be at 50 up, because I think it's people in my age group. So 60 up would be coming soon. But anyway, it shows you how their lives change over the course of the last 50 years. The cross-sectional method is in the cross-sectional method. Instead of following a set of individuals over a number of years, researchers select a sample that includes people of different ages. This allows researchers to compare behavior of participants at different age groups. This way, they don't have to wait 50 years to find out what happens. What they do is they pick people of different ages, say 10 years apart, and interview them. They would have similar socioeconomic characteristics, sex, and that kind of stuff, and to try to make them as similar as possible. And then you can extrapolate from that the 10-year-old should be somewhere like this when he's 50 or something. So that's how a cross-sectional method, these are similar experiences. Naturalistic observation is when psychologists observe children as they learn language naturally, such as while they interact with other children, they're using naturalistic observation. In naturalistic observation, psychologists try not to interfere with the individuals they are observing. So what you would do in a naturalistic observation is you would go out and you might just watch how people behave when put into a particular situation. Like, for instance, you could observe people's behavior at mask wearing in a when going to a restaurant. I don't know. The laboratory observation method, on the other hand, is when psychologists observe behavior in a laboratory rather than in the field, and they're conducting laboratory observation. In a laboratory is any place that provides the opportunity for observation and the experimentation. The Skinner box and the maze are both examples of laboratories. And here, oftentimes, unlike in the naturalistic observation, the subject will be manipulated by the psychologist. So the testing method. Description: several types of tests various elements of human behavior, such as their abilities, interests, and personality. The advantage of the testing method is it's a convenient method for researchers to gain insight into certain aspects of an individual's ability or behavior. The disadvantage: it does not always provide a complete representation of the individual's true abilities or personality. The case study method. Description is researchers conduct in-depth investigations of individuals or small groups. Advantages: provides insight into specific cases. Disadvantages is they may focus on isolated circumstances or events that cannot be replicated. People are interviewed in case studies, may distort their past experiences. Researchers may unintentionally encourage people to answer questions a certain way. The longitudinal method is a group of participants are observed at intervals over an extended period of time. Advantages is that it enables researchers to see how individuals change over time. It's time-consuming and expensive. Participants may not be available for the duration of the study. Description: researchers compare differences and similarities of the cross-sectional method. Researchers compared differences and similarities among people in different age groups at a given time. The advantages is it's less time-consuming than longitudinal method for study changes over time. Differences between members of the sample cannot be necessarily be attributed to age or development. Naturalistic observation. Researchers observe the behavior of people or animals in their natural habitat. Habits. Advantages: enables researchers to witness the behavior of animals, people or animals in settings that are not artificial. Disadvantages: researchers have no control over settings of the events that occur. Laboratory observation. Participants are observed in a laboratory setting. It enables researchers to precisely control certain aspects of the study. Disadvantages: laboratories cannot be duplicate real-life environments. One method psychologists use to analyze and interpret their observation is correlation. Correlation is a measure of how closely one thing is related to another. The stronger the correlation between two things, the more closely the two things are related. Positive correlation occurs when an increase in one thing is accompanied by the increase in another. A negative correlation occurs when a decrease in one thing is accompanied by a decrease in the other. Correlation describes a relationship, but it does not reveal cause and effect. Just because two things are related does not necessarily mean that one causes the other. Environmental psychology is a relatively new field that focuses on the interaction between people and their surroundings. It draws on anthropology, geography, urban design, and architecture. Researchers in this field observe people in real-life settings. By using this method, they can make recommendations about shaping the environment. The environmental psychology movement can be traced back to the work of Roger Barker, who developed the idea of behavior setting. The graduate center of the SUNY represents more recent developments in environmental psychology. Environmental psychology has had a big impact on the commercial venues where people spend money, such as stores, malls, stadiums, and casinos. Most research is done in environmental psychology takes place in the field rather than in the lab. This is an example of how environmental psychology has affected the development of a mall, and this is the Eaton Center in Toronto, Canada. And this is the Grand Century Plaza in the Hong Kong, China. Section 4, Experimental and Ethical Research Issues. Researchers use experiments to answer questions about the cause and effect. When conducting experiments, researchers must consider such things as independent and dependent variables, control groups, and the placebo effect. Psychologists follow ethical practices and standards when working with people or animals. The main idea of this section is the experimental method is used by researchers to answer questions about cause and effect. In addition, the psychologist must consider ethical issues involved in the experiments. So what you should be looking for here is how would you describe the primary purpose of the experimental method? What is the purpose of the single and double-blind study? Why do researchers measure central tendency and dispersion? And what are the three overriding ethical issues in psychology? Why do scientists sometimes conduct research with animals? Psychologists use the experimental method to answer questions about cause and effect. Independent and dependent variables. Experiments have variables which are factors that can vary or change. The independent variable is the factor that researchers manipulate. The dependent variable is the factor whose value depends on the change made to the independent variable. Experimental and control groups. Members of the experimental group receive the treatment. Members of the control group do not. All other conditions are held constant for both the experimental group and the control group. A controlled experiment uses both the control group and experimental group. The placebo is a substance or treatment that has no effect apart from the person's belief in its effect. Feeling better simply because we expect to feel better and for no other reason, it is an example of the placebo effect. Single-blind studies. A single-blind study keeps participants unaware of the treatment they are receiving. Participants do not know if they are in the experimental group or control group. This is one reason that researchers can avoid the influence of expectations. Double-blind study is one in which group participants and researchers are unaware of who receives the treatment. Double-blind studies help researchers avoid the influence and expectations and remain unbiased. So in this chart here, you can see how the single blind and double-blind experiments work. In a single-blind experiment, the researcher is aware, the participant is unaware, and the experiment organizer is aware. In the double-blind experiment, the researcher is unaware, the participant is unaware, and the experiment organizer is the person who is aware. So in both the single-blind and double-blind experiments, researchers must guard against bias in favor of certain points of view by keeping participants unaware of their treatment. Central tendency and disposition. A common technique used to generalize data is to measure the central tendency. The central tendency is a number that describes the average score of distribution. Finding the mean, the median, or the mode are always ways of arriving at central tendency. The mean is average score of distribution, the median is the middle score, the mode is the most frequent score. Researchers use range and standard deviation to document the variability of a score. Range is the difference between the lowest score and the highest score. Standard deviation is a measure of distance of every score to the mean. So this is your standard deviation bell curve graph. And this would be the ideal breakdown of how it would work. Ethics are standards for proper and responsible behavior. The American Psychological Association has established specific ethical guidelines that psychologists are required to follow. Research with people. There are ethical standards that limit type of research psychologists may conduct with people. A leading ethical principle is that the study participants may not be harmed. Confidentiality. Psychologists treat the records of research participants and clients as confidential. Only in certain cases may psychologists disregard confidentiality. Informed consent. The APA generally requires that people who volunteer to participate in research studies provide informed consent. Informed consent means that people agree or consent to participate in a research study only after they receive a general overview of the study and have been given the choice of whether or not to participate. Deception. Some psychological experiments, however, cannot be run without deceiving people. New drug experiments, other blind studies cannot be conducted without keeping participants unaware of the treatment or of the nature of the study. Psychologists follow APA guidelines when they use deception. So when you go to do your research, you inform your subject that you're studying. Psychologists follow strict ethical rules in how they produce, store, and present their data. They need to be objective as possible when they're conducting a study in order to avoid bias, and they must be willing to discuss their hypothesis in light of contradictory evidence collected in research. Doing otherwise would be misleading and thus unethical. The American Psychological Association has a detailed statement of principles and code of conduct that are divided into 10 major categories listed below are 8 ways to resolve ethical issues from the first category of the ethical standards. For complete ethical principles of psychologists and code of conduct, see the reference section at the back of your book. Misuse of work. Psychologists take reasonable steps to correct misuse of their work. Legal and ethical conflicts. Psychologists take steps to resolve the conflicts between their professional and ethical responsibilities on the one hand and the official laws and regulations on the others. Ethical conflicts with organizations. Psychologists clarify any conflict between the APA ethics code and the demands of an organization which they are affiliated or for whom they happen to be working. Informal resolution violations. Psychologists attempt to resolve an ethical violation by another psychologist by first bringing it to the attention of that person in an attempt to informally resolve the problems. Reporting violations. Psychologists take further action if an ethical violation has harmed or is likely to harm a person or organization that does not lend itself to an informal resolution of the problem. Cooperation. Psychologists cooperate in ethics and investigations. Complaints. Psychologists do not file or encourage the filing of reckless ethics complaints. Rather, they carefully consider the circumstances of the situation. unfair discrimination. Psychologists do not deny others professional advancement based solely upon their having been subject of an ethics complaint if the complaint is unjustified or unsubstantiated. Research with animals. Most psychological studies that use animals do not harm the animals. Some psychologists and other scientists conduct research that may be harmful to animals. Such studies often use animals because they cannot be carried out with people for ethical reasons. Psychologists use animals only when there is no alternative and when they believe the benefit outweighs the harm. Only a small number of psychological studies involve animals. Many people, however, believe that it is no more ethical to harm animals than it is to harm people. The American Psychological Association has rules of ethics for how animals are used in research and should be treated. So we could do, or you could do this experiment. You might be able to do this at home if you have enough members of your family. We could do this at school if we had the opportunity. Among students at our school are stated preferences for cola, soft drinks, tortilla chips, consistent with preferences with these items when they are taste tested, the famous Coca-Cola or Pepsi challenge. The premise of the experiment is to conduct a double-blind taste test study. Begin by recording favorite soda, flavors, favorite tortilla chip, and flavors. Then you conduct the experiment. Use a shield between the subject and the tester. Use a blindfold for the subject. Have the subject test 3 cups of soda poured by assistants who know which soda is in which cup. Use a shield between the subject and the tester. Use a blindfold of the subject to follow the same steps with the tortilla chips as with the cola drinks. Use the same brand of chips but 3 different flavors. The subject tests 3 servings of chips by the assistants who have recorded which chips are in which bowl. Then what you determined was the hypothesis proved, which subject matter that you studied in this chapter touched upon by the experiment, and what did you learn from this experiment? So that concludes our discussion of Chapter 2. I hope you found this useful, and we will continue on with Chapter 3 next.